In January 2001, Michael Bolton sat down with Billboard magazine and called the whole thing an atrocity. He said, and these are his actual words, "It's been hell, and at one point when the jury verdict came in, it nearly ruined my life because I felt so much like a child had been pulled from me. I have no faith in the justice system." This was a man who had spent nearly 8 years fighting a copyright case in federal court, all the way to the United States Supreme Court, over a song he insisted he had written himself from scratch. The case was Bolton versus the Isley Brothers. The verdict was $5.4 million. At the time, the largest award in the history of music plagiarism litigation. And the question that makes it so fascinating and so troubling, depending on where you stand, is whether the jury actually got it right. Let's go back to where the Isley Brothers started, because the story only makes sense if you understand who they were and what they had built by the time this all happened. Ronald O'Kelly and Rudolph Isley grew up in the Lincoln Heights suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Their father, O'Kelly Sr., had been a vaudeville performer. Their mother, Sally, guided the elder boys in singing in church from an early age. There was a fourth brother, Vernon, but Vernon was killed in a bicycle accident as a child, and after that, the 3 remaining brothers became the core of what would become one of the longest-running acts in American music. They started performing together in 1954, moved to New York City in the late 1950s, and by 1959, they had landed a deal with RCA Victor. That same year, they recorded Shout, which they had essentially improvised during a live performance while opening for Jackie Wilson in Washington, D.C. Ronald had ad-libbed the phrase during a cover of Wilson's Lonely Teardrops. The crowd went wild, and RCA encouraged them to put it on tape. Shout peaked at number 47 on the Billboard Hot 100. It wasn't a smash, but it sold over 1 million copies and earned a gold disc. And it became one of those songs that burrowed into American culture so deeply that most people now have no idea who wrote it. 3 years later, on Wand Records, they recorded Twist and Shout, a song written by Burt Burns that the top notes had originally cut badly. The Isleys recorded it with the energy that would become their signature and took it to number 17 on the Hot 100 and number 2 on the R&B chart in 1962. The Beatles covered it on their debut album in 1963 and made it world famous, but the Isleys were there first, and that matters. Through the early 1960s, the Isley Brothers moved through several labels: RCA, Wand, then their own imprint Thicke, which they founded in 1964, then United Artists, then Motown. And it was during that United Artists period, in January 1964, that they recorded a song called Love is a Wonderful Thing. They copyrighted it on February 6, 1964. United Artists didn't release it as a single until June 1966, and when it finally came out, it barely registered, reaching only number 110 on Billboard's Bubbling Under chart, which is the chart for songs that almost made the Hot 100 but didn't quite get there. It was never included on any of their studio albums. It ran just under 2 minutes. It was, by any commercial measure, a footnote. The Isleys moved to Motown the following year, scored a hit with This Old Heart of Mine in 1966, eventually revived Thicke in 1969, and released It's Your Thing, which went to number 2 on the pop chart and won them a Grammy. By the early 1970s, younger brothers Ernie and Marvin, along with brother-in-law Chris Jasper, had joined the band, and they became a full 6-piece outfit. That Lady, Fight the Power, For the Love of You, Between the Sheets. These are the records that built their legacy through the 70s and into the 80s. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1992. Now we move to Michael Bolton. Born Michael Bolton in New Haven, Connecticut, he had been in the music business since the 1970s without much commercial success. He changed his name, kept grinding, and eventually broke through in the late 1980s and early 1990s as one of the biggest selling adult contemporary artists in the world. His album Soul Provider went 5 times platinum in 1989. Then came Time, Love, and Tenderness in 1991, produced on Columbia Records, and Bolton and his co-writer Andrew Goldmark had written a song for it called Love is a Wonderful Thing. They wrote it in early 1990. It was released as a single in April 1991, reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, Bolton's biggest chart hit, and became one of the most played songs on adult contemporary radio that year. Ronald Isley heard it on the radio. And according to Ronald himself, his first reaction was actually pleasure. In an interview, he said, "When I first heard his version of the song on the radio, I was really pleased. Then I went out to pick up the record and looked for my credit. I was upset because the credits weren't on there. So we got in touch with his people, and then he went into the, 'Oh, I didn't know you all had a song like this.'" On February 24th, 1992, the Isley Brothers Publishing Company, Three Boys Music Corporation, filed a copyright infringement action in federal court against Michael Bolton, Andrew Goldmark, and Sony Music Publishing. Bolton's defense was unambiguous. He had never heard the Isley Brothers song. His manager, Louis Levin, said publicly, "The song is an original song. We view the claim to be without merit and are vigorously defending the matter." Bolton pointed out during trial that the Isley Brothers' "Love is a Wonderful Thing" had never appeared on any of their studio albums. He brought in copies of TV Guide from 1966, showing that television programs which reportedly aired the song never featured the Isley Brothers during the period in question in his Connecticut hometown. And he noted that there were 151 separately copyrighted songs registered under the title "Love is a Wonderful Thing," 85 of them before 1964, which made the title itself essentially a generic phrase that no one could reasonably claim to own. The Isley Brothers' legal team countered by arguing that Bolton and Goldmark were Connecticut teenagers obsessed with rhythm and blues music in the mid-1960s. The song had received some radio and television airplay, even if limited. Two R&B saturated teenagers could plausibly have heard an Isley Brothers single played somewhere, a radio station, a TV show, a friend's record collection, absorbed it without consciously registering it, and then reproduced elements of it 20 years later, while genuinely believing they were creating something original. This theory is known in copyright law as subconscious copying, and it had already succeeded in court before. George Harrison was found liable on exactly those grounds in a 1976 case involving "My Sweet Lord" and the Chiffons' "He's So Fine." The parties agreed to a three-phase trial. On April 25, 1994, a Los Angeles jury completed the first phase and found that Bolton and Goldmark had infringed the Isley Brothers' copyright. The jury identified 5 specific instances of infringement in the Bolton song. 5 days later, they completed the damages phase and found that Bolton's "Love is a Wonderful Thing" had accounted for 28% of the profits from the entire Time, Love, and Tenderness album, and that 66% of the profits from the song itself were attributable to the infringing elements. On May 9, 1994, the district court entered judgment. When the final damages were allocated, Sony Music paying $4.2 million, Bolton personally paying $932,924, Goldmark paying $220,785 with additional amounts from their publishing companies. The total came to more than $5.4 million, the largest plagiarism award in music history up to that point. The reaction in the industry was divided. Rolling Stone contributor Havelock Nelson sided with the jury. He said Bolton's song does bear a slight similarity to the Isleys, enough to call it a knockoff. Both titles have a bright, gospel-y feel and a similar, repeated hook line. But Michael Walsh of Time magazine went the other direction entirely. He called the verdict an utter travesty rendered by unmusical jurors, adding that, aside from the shared title and the fact that both songs begin their melody on the third note of the scale, the two songs bore no significant musical resemblance. Bolton appealed. The case went through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Bolton's legal team included Harvard University law professor Alan Dershowitz, who argued to the Supreme Court that a national standard needed to be created to give artists and courts clear guidance on what actually constitutes copyright infringement. Remarkably, the Recording Industry Association of America, the RIAA, filed a brief supporting Bolton's appeal, which tells you something about how nervous the industry was about where this precedent was heading. In May 2000, the Ninth Circuit upheld the verdict in full. On January 22, 2001, the Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal. It was finished. Bolton spoke to Billboard shortly after. Beyond calling it an atrocity, he said something that captures the psychological weight of the whole experience. "We were so 100% involved in the independent creation of this song. To have it torn from you forever, and then to be fined for it is an atrocity that is psychologically a very tough pill to swallow. He also noted bitterly that during the appellate proceedings, one of the judges had asked whether the Isley song was on one of their albums, which was precisely the point, that it wasn't, that it was nearly impossible to find, and yet the jury had still decided he must have been exposed to it. Ronald Isley, for his part, told Billboard that the verdict was justice. "We can't take an R. Kelly song and call it an Isley Brothers song," he said. "No one should take a bow with another man's hat." And that's what he did. What this case left behind isn't just a dollar figure. The Ninth Circuit's ruling created legal precedent in the Western United States for how access to a song can be established even without direct evidence of exposure. The idea that two teenagers who loved R&B music in the mid-1960s could plausibly have heard a song that barely charted, never appeared on an album, and wasn't a known part of any radio station's regular rotation, and that this plausibility alone was sufficient to satisfy the access requirement, that's a ruling with consequences. It told every working songwriter that the legal exposure from subconscious copying is real, and that the bar for proving you were exposed to something is lower than most people realized. You can draw a line from this verdict to the Blurred Lines case in 2015, where Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams were ordered to pay $7.3 million to Marvin Gaye's estate, not for copying specific notes, for capturing the feel and atmosphere of Gaye's 1977 track, Gotta Give It Up. The Bolton case hadn't resolved the underlying tension in music copyright law. It had deepened it. And that tension is still very much alive in courtrooms today. Here's what I genuinely like to know from you. When you listen to both songs, does it sound like theft to you, or does it sound like two people who loved the same kind of music and arrived at something similar? There's no clean answer to that, and I think that's exactly what makes this case still worth arguing about 30 years later. Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're new here and you like music history told without the spin, subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming.